Infantry are no longer the best archetype. There, I said the title of the video. Now, this isn't to say that they're bad by any means, because that would be a very far stretch from the truth. That being said, I wouldn't say infantry are as dominant as they once were. And what I mean by that is that it's less that they're bad and more that they're not the de facto option anymore. Nowadays, we have a lot more archetypes with niches that are worth considering now, which has led to a lot more nuance when it comes to team building, even though with the homogeny issue that there is in the game, given that a lot of units are pretty much running more or less the same stuff. In my opinion, having the ability to run any sort of unit you really want to, even if it falls into a specific archetype, is probably the best thing the game has to offer at the moment. No longer do you have to really feel bad about building a favorite character that you like and not necessarily get any mileage out of it. Even though there are better options, it's not as if the barrier of entry is going to be so difficult to achieve now. That being said, that's only for 3 of the 4 archetypes in my opinion. Right now, as far as niches are concerned, I think armors, flyers, and infantry have plenty to offer. Armors definitely because of saviors and hardy fighter and a lot of the other stuff they have, which is more so just a lot of fighter variants. In my opinion, armors are one of those archetypes you just can't really get rid of nowadays because of how much defensive prowess they offer, which is not only important for something like turn 1 strategies and Aether raids, maybe for protection in summoner duels so you don't get immediately blown the hell out, even though there are scenarios where you just can't use saviors, aka erosion week, which by the way is happening right now. Fun stuff. Not really. Even so, in a lot of modes, you're typically running in armor because they offer so many protective benefits that you can't really get out of any other niche at the moment. Meanwhile, you have flyers who are incredibly good frontliners nowadays because of their access to guard bearing and guidance, which is an incredible combination, not only for just sitting in place and acting as a really good tank, but also the mixed utility that you get out of it because you can allow allies to teleport in and act relatively well offensively. And in some scenarios, you could also have your flyers act as near saves because of the likes of Soren, but that's more specifically tied to him more than the archetype itself. Even so, there's some of our tankier units nowadays, and their access to stuff like guidance means that you can pretty much use this on any sort of unit that you really want to. Even if they don't have access to the likes of guard bearing or gambit, they can still use guidance and still provide a decent amount of utility that you really aren't going to be getting out of any other archetype. And as for the archetype that led the beginning of this video, infantry, I would say prior to all these skill additions, you know, saves, guidance, guard bearing, they were pretty much the de facto option when it came to pretty much any sort of standard building in the game. You always built infantry because they had access to everything. And while I would definitely say they still have the best skill accessibility in the game, it's not so dominant that you just can't get away with infantry a lot of the time, although it obviously depends. More often than not, you're going to be building an armor and a flyer now because of what they can offer in their own archetype as well. And for infantry's sake, I would say that they definitely rely on flyers and armors a lot more nowadays than they ever have, just for defensive and offensive pressure. And that's something you're never going to take away from infantry. Their skill accessibility is always going to remain one of the best things about their archetype, and even if they aren't necessarily the best, I would argue armors, flyers, and infantry are relatively equal in a lot of areas. Not necessarily because they all accomplish the same thing, but because they all have different aspects about each archetype that a lot of them can't really replicate without. That being said, if you've noticed I've lacked to mention cavalry throughout this entire video, it's because, in my opinion, they're the only archetype without any sort of notable niche. I think the biggest thing they have going for them is movement, but that alone, in my opinion, isn't really enough to stand out. Simply put, I think they need something more. And I guess the best way to put it into perspective is building a generic cav versus building any other generic. For example, I could build somebody like Florina or Henry or Sheena, and they have predefined niches I can get out of them. One's a guard-bearing gambit tank with guidance support, one's a save, and one's a nuke, even though Henry doesn't exactly have the best attack. Even so, there are predefined niches I can find out of them. As for Cavs, they have their movement and are predominantly player phase, which isn't bad by any means, but more often than not, they're not going to be accomplishing the same amount of stuff as a lot of the other archetypes simply because they don't have the skill accessibility, especially the ranged ones, which definitely lack a lot more comparatively. Even so, I wouldn't say it's completely doom and gloom because they have a good baseline in movement, which is still one of the better things you could have in the game at this time. But chances are, if you are running a cav unit, there's a good chance they already have a PRF in tow, and they're not really running something like an arcane because the skill gap gap between a generic and one with a PRF is much more staggering comparatively to a lot of the other archetypes. That being said, I think there are plenty of things they can do to make them a lot more worthwhile investments. As I did mention earlier, I think the biggest thing they have going for them is their movement, but in my opinion, they need to be able to take advantage of their movement way more, whether that's through DPS options, terrain gimmicks, or even more movement options available to them. DPS wise, I think damage reduction shredding based on spaces moved could easily be something that allows them to stand out a bit more. Granted, I don't think they want to give cavalry that type of ability as we've seen throughout the entirety of this year. Even so, if they are going to be predominantly player phase, I think they're going to need a lot more capabilities in the player phase because it's arguably a much harder archetype to get going comparatively to the enemy phase. Whether it is damage reduction shredding based on spaces moved or something else entirely, boosting up their DPS options could be something to do down the road, and it's definitely one of the easiest things they could come up with. That being said, I think one of the more interesting gimmicks that they can do going forward, and this is something they haven't really touched on since CYL, is more terrain gimmicks. Flared Sparrow, which is accessible to flyers and cavalry, is able to set up a lot of fiery terrain, which negates a lot of movement for ranged units. That being said, being able to set it up is definitely its biggest boon, and obviously when it comes to threat range and just setting up, cavalry definitely have the advantage because of the amount of movement they have access to innately. And in my opinion, it's definitely a boon to run cavs over flyers in that particular area. I think moving forward, if they end up adding more terrain gimmicks that focus on player phasing in particular, then cavalry can definitely have a much bigger niche, but they're definitely still going to need more DPS options anyway. That being said, to keep them more standoutish, I do think adding more terrain gimmicks that benefit from cavalry over flyers can be something that they lean into a lot more. Otherwise, I think more movement gimmicks can be really good. I think as far as hit and run strategies go, outside of your Canto Distance and Canto Recall, usually you're running stuff like Infantry because of close call, because they have access to damage reduction. Cavalry, you could still use something like hit and run, but in my opinion, it's still a lot more finicky because you're losing out on combative capabilities, which isn't bad by any means if you have the PRF to back it up, but not a lot of units are able to do that. And with stuff like Alarm and hit and run / close call or any of those, you're still able to move 2 spaces after combat, which is incredibly useful. So in my opinion, if they're going to take advantage of their movement, they want to have more options available to them, even if it's just more inheritable skills that only they can get specifically. Although there is one more idea I definitely have in the back of my mind. This can be something that doesn't necessarily increase their damage output per se, but it increases their threat range by a very significant amount, and that's giving them even more movement than they already have. You already know stuff like Brave Seliph, Brave Karam, Summer Ephraim have extremely high threat ranges, and it does help that they are coupled with really good weapons and effects that allow them to do decent amount of damage and work. You have somebody like Sane who also has really good threat range, but he definitely locks in the combative side because all his weapon really has to offer is Canto. I think having some sort of external skill that you can inherit that grants additional movement to cavalry specifically can be very beneficial in its own right. That being said, it could also be incredibly toxic for specific units, but there are benefits and drawbacks to pretty much anything in this game. And those are pretty much the ideas I have. I'm pretty sure there's probably a lot of other stuff that can be done with them to make them stand out, but in my opinion, they're still a bit lacking. As far as the rest of the archetypes go, I would say overall they're much more balanced across the board, but hopefully in the future, Cavs will be able to get something that will at least allow them to stand out in their own way. However, what that'll be, I have no idea.